If you're watching this short information film, it's because you as an adult are perhaps considering that you may have ADHD, or perhaps your GP may have already referred you onto a pathway to have an assessment. So what is ADHD? Well, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. It is not a behavioural disorder, by the way. That is another myth. But it's a neurodevelopmental condition. It means your brain grows and functions in a slightly different way, and it affects at least 1 in 20 people. It can be very challenging when you're young, in school, but by adulthood, when your brain reaches full maturity in early 20s, for most of us, we've learned how to manage our ADHD reasonably well, and often chosen careers and lifestyles where we've learned to play to our strengths, and ADHD isn't particularly debilitating. But for some of us, living with ADHD can be particularly challenging. And what do we mean by ADHD? Well, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder sounds quite grim, doesn't it? Inattention, poor concentration, forgetfulness can be really hindering and a real nuisance. So in some of the information films that we're going to talk about, how to manage some of these challenges or difficulties in an effective way that will help you. But for the purposes of this short film, we want to explain what ADHD is. It's genetic in origin. It means your brain functions slightly differently. It is very common. It affects more than 1 in 20 people. And there are many people who lead happy, healthy and successful lives with ADHD. Not everybody has all of the 3 core elements of inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity. Some people only have 2. And it's the extent to which those characteristics impair your life that determine whether or not you might meet the criteria for a formal diagnosis of ADHD. I find being hyperactive actually a real positive. It gives me lots of energy, enthusiasm and drive. I have lots of strategies that help me manage my ADHD quite successfully. But ADHD is not just about those 3 core characteristics, because there are secondary things that go with that. If you've got a poor memory, then it can impact on many areas of your life. If you are impulsive, then you can express that impulsivity in a lot of ways. You can be decisive and solution focused, but you can also make decisions too quickly without considering the consequences. You might speak before thinking about what you've really wanted to say or the impact of what you're going to say. You might find yourself interrupting other people, and other people might think that you're rude. You might be an impulse shopper and therefore have difficulty managing a budget. So impulsivity can be a real challenge. Inattention, being forgetful, finding it difficult to organise yourself, completing a task can also be really debilitating. Being hyperactive, sometimes in certain contexts, for example, being sat in a cinema, or at night time when you're trying to sleep and you've got that restless leg, or you find yourself in a meeting and you're tapping or fidgeting with things, or constantly shaking your knee. Those 3 core characteristics are what would be considered when having an assessment for ADHD. And not everybody chooses to go and get a formal diagnosis. And we'll talk about that in some of the other information films. There are many people who manage ADHD successfully, but we recognise that many adults out there have lived their lives not knowing they have ADHD and are now on this journey of discovery where they're learning about themselves and trying to understand how to play to their strengths and manage some of those challenges more effectively. So when we're talking about ADHD, and in some of these information films, we're going to be looking at things like executive functioning skills, sleep. Many people with ADHD find it difficult to sleep and survive on very little sleep, or find it difficult to get to sleep because their mind is racing. Things like sensory difficulties. So one of the ways that my ADHD impacts on me is I have heightened senses. Noises seem much louder to me. The temperature of the room, I notice heat and cold much more. It's not a core characteristic of ADHD, but it's one of those other characteristics that you find co-occur with ADHD. Now, I mentioned ADHD as a neurodevelopmental condition. It co-occurs with a number of other neurodevelopmental conditions, which some of you may be familiar with. Dyslexia, which affects 1 in 10 people, is also really common in people with ADHD, possibly affecting as many as 4 out of every 10 people with ADHD will also have dyslexia. 1 in 20 people are affected by dyspraxia, which affects coordination, but it also affects how you process information through your brain and nervous system. Some people with ADHD may have co-occurring dyspraxia. Some people may have co-occurring dyscalculia, which is a bit like the number version of dyslexia. Some people may even experience or have traits of autism, because we know there are certain genetic overlaps. And there will be some people that at some point in their lives may experience tics or Tourette's. I know when I was a child I had facial tics, but I grew out of them. They were there for a couple of years. But we know that for some people, those tics, they could be verbal, motor, can happen at any time and then disappear just as quickly, but often appear when we're feeling particularly stressful, or for some people when they're on certain types of medication. So ADHD, we know, has 3 core elements: inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, but we know it can affect us in other ways as well, and it sometimes co-occurs with other learning differences. They are learning differences. They are very common. I know that in schools we sometimes refer to them as learning difficulties or learning disabilities, but what we've got to remember is that 1 in 5 people have either ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. So there is an evolutionary reason why nearly 1/5 of the human race have these brains that think differently. So try not to think of yourself as disordered. Do not think of yourself as mentally ill. ADHD is about how you process information and how you respond or interact with your environment based on how your brain assimilates the information it receives from its environment and sometimes the thoughts in your own head. So we know that some of the challenges can be really impairing for some people, but we also know that the context matters. So in work, for example, that might be the most challenging context for you when managing your ADHD, with your time management and your need to focus and concentrate and organise things. That might be the context where you might experience the most difficulty. At home, your ADHD might not bother you at all. Socially, out with your friends, your ADHD might not bother you at all. So we need to really consider this, and there is a really useful booklet that you can see on the screen, and this will give you lots of information about what ADHD is, what it isn't, how it might impact on you, and some strategies to manage it effectively. And then there will be a series of other short films where you can learn more about ADHD and how you can learn to live with ADHD more successfully. Thanks very much.